There is a famous legend about the communist revolutionary and the first premier of the People's Republic of China, Zhou Enlai. When asked by a Western diplomat about his opinion on the French Revolution, Zhou Enlai replied by saying, "It's too early to say. It's a great story that sadly did not actually happen." In reality, Zhou Enlai was being asked about the 1968 revolt in Paris that only just occurred at the time. But the original news report was mistranslated to make it seem as if he was responding to the Great French Revolution that began in 1789. Nevertheless, there is a certain truth to Zhou Enlai's apocryphal response in the sense that revolutions often lack a scholarly consensus among historians to explain what they really were. There is rarely agreement on the causes, outcomes, and whether or not such uprisings are positive or negative for the advancement and well-being of a given society. Thus, if it is too early to say to give a definitive assessment on the French Revolution, which happened hundreds of years ago, then the same could be said of the Arab Spring as it approaches its 15th anniversary. There is no lack of scholarship when it comes to the insurrections that shook the Middle East and North Africa starting from December 2010 when the first wave of popular revolts began in Tunisia, and spread to other parts of the region from Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, as well as other protest movements in various countries. Yet, no consensus among journalists or historians explains what the Arab Spring even was. Some have called the events a revolution, while others have not. Gilbert Ashkar of the University of London, for instance, said what happened in the Arab world was a beginning of a revolutionary process, while Asif Bayat of the University of Illinois wrote that it would be more accurate to refer to the uprisings as what he calls reformlutions, which are revolutionary in terms of movement and mass mobilization, but reformist in terms of strategy and vision for change. There are also disagreements on what roles the political actors played in the insurrection. When it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood, which took power briefly in Egypt following the 2012 elections, former Tufts University professor Hugh Roberts has written that the group had taken a markedly democratic direction, while Eric Traeger of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy wrote that the Brotherhood didn't actually believe in democracy at all. When it comes to the role the United States played in the events of the Arab Spring, Amy Austin Holmes at George Washington University emphasized the role of the American empire. At the same time, New York Times correspondent Robert F. Worth downplayed the significance of the actions of the Obama administration. There are so many disagreements among historians that even calling the events that shook the region quote-unquote Arab Spring has been questioned, as many other non-Arab ethnic groups, such as the Nubians in Egypt, played a large part in the uprising. However, if there's one thing that scholars can agree on, it is that the Arab Spring, at least in Egypt, has been a disappointment for the advancement of democracy. For those who are unfamiliar with the events of the Egyptian Arab Spring, here's a brief overview. On January 25, 2011, a youth-led popular uprising erupted against the 30-year dictatorship of Hosni Mubarak. On February 11th, after 18 days of civil unrest, Mubarak relinquished power and a transitional government took place under the rule of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Eventually, a presidential election took place in May and June of 2012, in which a member of the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood, Mohamed Morsi, became the first democratically elected president of Egypt. But Morsi's favorability ratings soon declined, as he proposed an unpopular constitution and failed to abandon some of Mubarak's neoliberal economic policies. Just a year into Morsi's tenure, another massive protest movement emerged. In July 2013, using Morsi's unpopularity as a pretext, the military orchestrated a coup and democracy was overthrown in Egypt. A year later, in 2014, a military general named Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was quote-unquote elected in a sham election, and the country returned to a dictatorship, one that is arguably more repressive than the Mubarak regime. So what went wrong? Why, after a strong popular revolt, did Egypt return to an authoritarian state? As I suggested earlier, there's no single explanation as to why the revolution failed. One factor, for instance, was the United States, which should be blamed for its shameful role in eroding democracy in Egypt. In fact, right after the 2013 coup, President Obama's Secretary of State John Kerry said that the generals who ousted the democratically elected Mohamed Morsi were restoring democracy, and falsely claimed that the military did not take over. Thereafter, the US seemed content with the brutal dictatorship of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. In 2016, Barack Obama himself even spelled it out when he quipped in an interview with The Atlantic that all he needed in the Middle East was a few smart autocrats. Subsequent presidents Donald Trump and Joe Biden continued to provide Egypt's dictator with over $1 billion in annual military aid. But it would not be reasonable to blame the fall of democracy in Egypt solely on the United States, because the military plot that ousted President Morsi in 2013 was not a covert regime change operation orchestrated by the United States, like the coups in Iran in 1953, Chile in 1973, or Haiti in 2004. The responsibility of the US in the collapse of democracy in Egypt cannot be considered decisive. While the Obama administration was willing to continue warm diplomatic relations with Sisi, the 2013 coup that overthrew Egypt's only democratically elected president had, in fact, popular support from the public. As political scientist Amy Austin Holmes writes in her book, Coups and Revolutions, Morsi was ousted by a coup from below, a coup driven by popular mobilization rather than by a cabal of conspirators within the officer corps. In fact, many of those who led the 2011 revolution ended up supporting the 2013 coup d'etat that reinstated an autocratic regime. Ezra Abdel Fattah, one of the founders of the April 6 youth movement, which played a pivotal role in organizing the 2011 uprising, enthusiastically supported the overthrow of Morsi and even went to travel to Western countries on behalf of the military government to sell the idea that what had happened in Egypt was not a coup, but a second revolution. Mohammed Arabaradeh, who became one of the leading liberal spokesmen for the 2011 revolution, appeared in a press conference standing next to Sisi after Morsi was ousted and was later appointed as the vice president of Egypt. Liberal parties like the Free Egyptian Party and the Social Democratic Party, which all backed the overthrow of Mubarak, would also go on to support the 2013 coup. All these political actors who supported Morsi's overthrow did not want to return to an authoritarian state, but they made a terrible miscalculation in believing that the military was the lesser evil to the Muslim Brotherhood, expecting another democratic transition after the coup. I was very happy Morsi was ousted and I celebrated on the streets all night with some friends, Ezra Abdel Fattah later recalled, but we should not have agreed to a transition period that allowed military rule to return. This mistake cost us a lot. Although Abdel Fattah claims she did not regret participating in the protests that helped oust Morsi, the organization she founded, the April 6 Youth Movement, would end up being banned under the authoritarian rule of Sisi. These disastrous mistakes, I believe, can be attributed to a total lack of strategic vision. As the sociologist Asif Bayat has described in the title of his magnificent book, the Arab Spring was a revolution without revolutionaries, where the Egyptian organizers were blessed by the startling response to the protest call and baffled on how to proceed with what had transpired. This is one of the key reasons why the revolution failed. There was neither an endgame that the revolutionaries imagined, nor a vision of what kind of society they wanted to create. As Bayat writes, for the Egyptian revolutionaries, politics of change appeared more of a matter of technicality than the idea of transforming the structures of governing power. It must be made clear, though, that this lack of strategic vision is not because the Arab Spring was a quote-unquote a leaderless movement, as political scientist Mark Lynch has claimed, as Rusha Latif has pointed out in her book, Tahrir's Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution. There were organizers who were protesting the Mubarak regime for years before 2011. In fact, between 2004 and 2009, there were some 1,900 protest actions in Egypt, including labor strikes. There were leaders in the Arab Spring with innovative and clever methods that were able to bring down the Mubarak dictatorship. However, while the revolutionaries possessed organizational leadership, they lacked ideological leadership. While there were many activist leaders capable of smart tactics, there was no philosophical leader to provide the strategic vision on how to proceed. This was one of the crippling blunders that led to the failure of the Egyptian Revolution. To understand what I mean, let's compare the Arab Spring to some of history's successful revolutions. The English Revolution in the 17th century had organizational leaders like Oliver Cromwell, who led the revolt against the tyrannical rule of King Charles I. At the same time, there were also ideological leaders such as John Milton, whose writings were enthusiastically consumed by the English revolutionaries. In the American Revolution of 1776, General George Washington led the Patriot armies against the British, but it was Thomas Paine's common sense that became the manifesto for the Patriots. In the radical phase of the French Revolution in 1792, when the monarchy was overthrown in the August 10th insurrection. The revolt was carefully planned by revolutionaries like Georges Danton, but as critical for its success were the writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose The Social Contract had a profound influence on all the leading French revolutionaries. In the Russian Revolution of 1917, Vladimir Lenin led the Bolsheviks in the seizure of power for the Soviets, but he was, of course, inspired by the author of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx. So on and so forth. Throughout even in the late 20th century, whether it was the Iranian Revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini, or the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa led by Nelson Mandela, even the more recent revolutionaries took direction from philosophers they read, like the sociologist Ali Sharianti or the psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. The point is that revolutions are better equipped to succeed when there is both organizational and ideological leadership. There needs to be the organizers who provide the tactics on how to revolt, but there also needs to be the philosophers who provide the vision, the ideological rationale for why they should revolt. The Arab Spring in Egypt in 2011 had the first ingredient for success. They had the organizational leaders, but unfortunately they were missing the second, the critical component. They lacked the necessary ideological leaders. They didn't have their own Rousseau or Marx on which to base their philosophy. Many of the demonstrators even seemed uninterested in having an ideology at all. When, for instance, political scientist Amy Austin Holmes interviewed one anonymous Egyptian protester during the Arab Spring, she asked him what he believed in, and he gave a vague answer and simply said equality. When Holmes asked if he was therefore a socialist, the protester responded, "No, I'm an Egyptian. Lenin and Marx, these people are dead. We will develop new ideas, a new world." The protesters' dismissive attitude towards past revolutionaries, however, begs the question, what were the new ideas he was speaking of? It wasn't just the rank-and-file protesters who lacked a philosophy. Many of the organizational leaders of the Arab Spring also lacked a nuanced ideology. Take, for example, Wael Ghonim, who was one of the key leaders during the first phase of the Egyptian Revolution. Ghonim was a computer engineer who created a viral Facebook page called "We Are All Khaled Said," which was named after a young Egyptian who was beaten to death by the police for alleged drug use. Appealing to a massive following on social media, Ghonim encouraged Egyptians to come out on January 25, 2011 to protest police brutality. The protest is now regarded as the starting date for the Arab Spring in Egypt. Although Ghonim proved to have organizational leadership with savvy social media skills, he was not, however, an ideological person. He admitted that he was not politically active before the revolution, and that he was no more than a guy with some marketing experience who started a Facebook page that snowballed into something greater than any of its thousands of contributors. He recalled that January 25th began as a reaction to the events in Tunisia, and that it was a simple invitation on Facebook that unexpectedly spread like wildfire across the entire web and moved into the streets. There were no master plans or strategies. Ghonim would come to recognize what had been missing. He later lamented that we failed to create leadership for this moment, admitting that the Arab Spring protesters lacked an ideology. The revolution was against a school of thought, a mentality, and this mentality is still ruling the country one way or another. But it wasn't just Ghonim's lack of an ideological foundation. It didn't seem as if the computer engineer was even literate in any political language. As Asif Bayat pointed out, Ghonim deployed marketing techniques to sell the protest and used jargon of marketing to brand, advertise, and sell the products of democracy and freedom. In the end, Wael Ghonim would retire from his short stint as a revolutionary and would work for Google's venture capital firm before creating his own startup. Although not the only reason, the fact that non-ideological figures like Ghonim were at the helm of the protests played a role in sinking the hopes of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a revolutionary and lasting change in Egypt. The first wave of revolution succeeded in 2011 because there was an understanding that Mubarak needed to be toppled. But because they weren't aligned with an ideology, the protesters didn't know how to proceed once the Egyptian dictator was gone. It wasn't as if the revolutionaries understood how to replace Mubarak with a socialist state or a Western-style liberal democracy. Even in the 2012 presidential election, when they had an opportunity to unite behind a candidate, many of the revolutionaries opted to boycott the election altogether. This left a power vacuum for the Muslim Brotherhood and later the military to take over. The failure of the Arab Spring provides us with a cautionary tale for other protest movements across the world, especially in the United States. Since the 2010s, there have been various uprisings in the US, from Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, and the recent No Kings protests. On the surface, Americans seems to have revolutionary potential with strong discontent with the status quo, and there's no lack of skillful activists in the United States with the ability to organize protests. But what's missing in today's social movements is the necessary grounding in a guiding philosophy, which is absolutely vital in creating a new and viable social order. If we look back at the recent protest movement since 2010, whether it was Occupy against Wall Street, BLM against the police, No Kings against Trump, the protests seemed to understand what they opposed, without offering any alternatives on what they were for. Occupy protesters were against capitalism, but they did not articulate a coherent vision for socialism. BLM said abolish the police without offering an alternative solution to the police. No Kings opposed Trump without offering progressive policies for a post-Trump America. And this lack of a guiding philosophy could be attributed to the fact that adult and particularly young adult literacy rates have declined quite significantly in recent years, with studies showing that a majority of the population now reads below a 6th grade level. Many contemporary social movements like Occupy, BLM, or No Kings were unideological because many of those protesters were functionally illiterate like the rest of America. During the peak of the George Floyd movement in 2020, for instance, protesters in San Francisco defaced and toppled a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, the general who won the Civil War against the Confederacy. More than an isolated instance of misdirected rage, this case encapsulates the historical illiteracy of these would-be revolutionaries. In the recent No Kings protests against Donald Trump, some protesters carried signs that read, "If Kamala were president, we'd all be at brunch." While their animosity towards Trump is valid, the fact that they believe that there would be nothing worth organizing under a Democratic administration shows their misunderstanding over the structures of power that produced a demagogue like Trump in the first place. The reason I believe movements like Occupy and BLM disappeared, and why I also think that anti-Trump campaigns of No Kings will also lose relevancy like the 2017 Women's March, is because of the absence of ideology. As Asif Bayat has written, for unlike ideological movements such as nationalism, socialism, or Islamism, which cemented enduring loyalty and identity, post-ideological movements tended to vanish as rapidly as they came to fruition. And the reason why many contemporary social movements are post-ideological can be explained from the growing illiteracy of the United States. The lesson of the Arab Spring is that one cannot lead a revolution without an ideology. One cannot hope to change society if it ignores the blueprints laid out by the great philosophers who came before us. We know how to organize already, and it is time to take a step back and understand what we are organizing for. We need to get back to reading Marx, Rousseau, Thomas Paine, and Franz Fanon. Aspiring revolutionaries must go back to creating reading groups with fellow comrades, and learn how to think before going out to organize. The first step of a revolution is opening a book.